Have you ever been wandering around in a game and something just doesn't feel right? It feels oddly familiar, nostalgic but strangely foreign and surreal. If you have felt that way, especially with games that are 2 to 3 decades old, then you're not alone. These are called liminal spaces. This aesthetic has been very prominent in the past couple of years, as people have been feeling very nostalgic about not only gaming, but life in general in the 90s and early 2000s. Especially since the Backrooms meme surfaced, it has become a staple in the internet culture. Vivid childhood memories that stick with you, like going to an arcade or remembering a hotel hallway. It just has a certain feel to it. It's hard to put into words. The empty, almost daunting atmosphere built in these settings give an uneasy but comforting feel. This feeling is translated into gaming almost completely unintentionally. Back in the 90s when gaming was embracing 3D, the renders of the textures used had to use as little memory as possible, resulting in almost smudged, stretched textures, which once combined together to try to replicate real-life setting, ends up just giving that empty, surreal feeling. This is especially noticeable in, for example, Mario 64, or pretty much any video game in that era. A lot of people view Mario 64 as a scary kind of game, just because of the atmosphere that's built. It was hard to shake that liminal space feeling during this time because the technology just wasn't good enough yet. The lighting and textures were left feeling almost stale and flat. A lot of games from the 90s and 2000s have liminal spaces. Spyro from the PS1 was one of the games I remember the most, with that liminal space feeling. The vast open fields mixed with the large architecture that is mostly just empty corridors connecting the parts of the level together. Playing that in the basement at 11 p.m. in the dark definitely gave me that nostalgic, eerie feeling. A lot of late 90s, early 2000s PC games gave that feeling too. Games like Quake and Half-Life both are great examples of this. Gmod and a lot of Valve games in general give off these vibes heavily. It's almost like there's something always watching you, and that is one of the best ways of describing a liminal space. It feels like there's supposed to be people and activity, but it's just completely stale and barren. The lighting and the color palettes used are sometimes dull, which give off an empty, unknown vibe. Growing up playing these games and thinking these graphics were so good, and now looking back on them today to get that strange feeling, is so weird, but in a way it makes sense. The worlds built in games from the 90s and 2000s are worlds that were explored and traveled already. Going back and visiting them today feels like visiting an abandoned town with nobody home. It's an eerie, almost nostalgic feeling. I play the original Halo games all the time. They still sometimes give me those creepy, empty vibes. Loading up a map by yourself and walking around will definitely give you those feelings. It's almost like you're not supposed to be there, like you're disrupting the silence and emptiness that was made purposefully. I really love this aesthetic because it reminds me of simpler times where worrying about jumping over a gap in Crash Bandicoot was the most I had to worry about. I bet a lot of people feel this way too about this era of video games. Most of them share that liminal space atmosphere that just can't be described. Liminal spaces in gaming are really interesting because when you see a liminal space picture, you almost get the urge to go explore it. Like, what's that in the distance? But in video games, you're in that setting, experiencing it firsthand. It sometimes gets to the point where walking through hallways and a complete open world have the same level of emptiness to them. The dull color palettes mixed with the plethora of lower textured polygons create almost the same atmosphere. It's super fun exploring liminal space in a video game, especially in games that you played as a kid. Trekking around familiar ground is such a nice kick of nostalgia. Although these settings have comforting feelings, you still can't quite shake the unsettling vibe that overcomes you. In real life, these places are filled with people and movement, but in game it's completely different because they're trying to replicate that realistic feeling. So you're left with this empty simulation of real life that almost feels haunting. It's an indescribable but really cool feeling created in gaming that you can't really see today unless you're playing a low budget project or an indie game. Liminal spaces in gaming are pretty much a thing of the past. That's why there's such eerie feelings attached to them. It's like an abandoned ghost town that stands completely still. Looking back on these liminal spaces, comparing them to games today, is really fascinating to see how far the technology has come. Games today are able to create much more of an immersive feeling. Okay, well, somewhat of an immersive feeling.